everyone to this third session. We have our panel is called Strengthening Cohesion of Russian Armed Forces, Gender and Spiritual Security. And my name is Katri Pynnöniemi. I work as an assistant professor here at the NDU and the and the University of Helsinki. We will have three presentators today with us, and all of the works are in a way work in progress. They are it will be super interesting to hear new ideas on this topic. So really looking forward to our discussions. We will our order of presentation is as mentioned in the program, and we will first hear all the presentators, and then have maybe a couple of short questions, and then in the end we will have our panel discussion. And it's my pleasure to invite the first speaker, Jonna Alava, who is a researcher at the NDU and also doctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki. And she will speak about her dissertation project that is about the Russian women and the representation of women soldiers in Russian armed forces. So welcome, Jonna, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Katri, and nice to meet you all here. Yes, as Katri said, my name is Jonna Alava. I'm a PhD student at the University of Helsinki and a researcher here at the Defense University in the Russia Research Group. And yes, I'm writing an article-based dissertations about the gender aspects in military patriotic education in Russia. This presentation is based on my second article. The idea for this study came when I was wondering why there are so many girls involved in military patriotic organizations in Russia. Do they want more women in the military? Knowing Russia's conservative politics and traditional values and gender roles, I wanted to explore the subject further. In this article, I analyzed representations of female soldiers from the Russian Armed Forces newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda, in English Red Star. Content of this representation. I will first explain how I conducted the research, then I present the historical context. After that I go into portrayals or archetypes. Soviet war propaganda and memorial culture formed these portrayals, but they are present in today's narratives as well. After that I give a quick look at how narratives have changed, and finally I present the conclusions. The research question of my article is how female soldiers are portrayed in the Russian armed forces. The study deconstructs gendered representations of Russian female soldiers in official media content and suggests how these narratives benefit the Russian military and warfare. A topic is easily hidden from the Western world, and feminist research itself is marginal in Russia, so this study brings new insights into that area. The newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda is one part of Russian military media, which include TV and radio channels and over 20 magazines and newspapers. This media output is not very popular in Russia, but it's massive anyway and effectively controlled. So we can assume that the representations in Krasnaya Zvezda are quite hegemonic and widespread. At least this media output conveys a political line from the Russian leadership to military personnel, and thereby they reproduce gender structures within the military. I chose to look at text around International Women's Day for a couple of reasons. Originally, the day was a revolutionary and feminist women's solidarity day, but in 1965 it was redesignated to honor all Soviet women and women war veterans. Therefore, women were included in the official war memorial culture, and the day started symbolically to connect militarism and women. The second reason is that on this day the Russian armed forces announces how many women are serving in the military and in which positions. These figures are hard to find elsewhere. I analyzed text from 20 February to 15 March every year from 2008, when the Russian military reform started, to the year 2021. The headword woman or women yielded 428 articles. 23rd February is Defender of the Fatherland Day in Russia, which I wanted to include in the analysis to examine how women are represented in that very masculine and popular celebration. Because of the selected time frame, focus on only one newspaper and the propagandist nature of Krasnaya Zvezda, this study is unable to encompass the entire image of female soldiers in Russian military media space. However, I noticed quickly that Women's Day hype lasted 2 or 3 issues, after which topics got back to random themes. So the sample was more representative of what I thought at first. As a method, I used a feminist approach to security narratives, critical discourse analysis, and some means of interpretive content analysis. The theoretical framework of the study is set at the intersection of 3 feminist studies on war and militarization. In brief, Cynthia Enlow sees that militaries need feminized ideas and concepts of womanhood as much as militarized masculinity to maintain patriarchal regimes in power. Secondly, Mary Wawrus used the term feminized militainment to refer to discursive practices that use constructions of women in various military-related roles to naturalize women's support for force and huge military spendings. The third study I rely on is Adrian Harris' Archetypes of Female Soldiers Who Participated in the Second World War and the meaning Soviet memorial culture gave to these portrayals. Russian female citizens got the right to apply to military service under a construct in 1999. In 2021, the Russian armed forces have 230,000 women in civilian posts and 40,000 female military personnel. Russian women participated as volunteer combatants, resistance fighters and partisans in 3 wars between 1914 and 1912 in Russia: World War, Russian Revolution and Civil War. In the Second World War there were more than 12,000 female combatants who were state mobilized and military trained. Representations of female soldiers have always been under political guidance. The public image of women soldiers in the Second World War was at first a woman heroine, but when demobilization approached it was replaced by the image of Rodina Mat, the motherland. This showed how authorities can quickly regulate public opinion and women's position in the military. Women's memories of war have always been separate memories or completely silenced in Russia. These Soviet representations are quite well studied, so it was logical to compare modern ones to them, especially when the myth of Great Patriotic War is at the center of Russia's ideology today. But let us now turn into portrayals. Rodina in English means a country of birth and Mat is mother, so a translation could be loosely a motherland or motherland mother. Rodina Mat refers to a Russian land as well as women, especially to mothers and wives on the home front. The quote above, or all the quote above, are from my research material. Rodina Mat was an umbrella archetype in Soviet war propaganda and memorial culture, and so it is today. She's an older woman who, with her heroic labor, brings victory closer. By its deeply gendered nature, the Rodina Mat maintains a collective identity and hierarchical relations between sexes. In Vladimir Putin's presidency, the symbol of Rodina Mat has been strengthening. I argue that the Rodina Mat is the most important role model for women in the military context. A woman's military profession is only a voluntary addition to it. This is seen in stories about female soldiers, as children and the husband are always mentioned. There is also a strong discourse how motherhood is the most important duty for women, including female soldiers. In addition to mothers, military's institutional well-being is largely dependent on military wives' work. They help to win civilian support for the military, calm anxieties of other wives, encourage their husbands to act like men, and do volunteer work on the base. These examples are not hard to find in my material. Wives are said to be fighting friends who are on duty even they don't wear epaulets, and whose housewife role is a high and difficult destiny. The concept of home front is closely related to Rodina Mat. It is used in two different meanings. The first one locates at the individual level in a time of peace where woman enables husband's military career and take care of the home and children. The second one happens at the national and more abstract level where women collectively take care of duties somewhere else than the battlefields. Handmaiden. Handmaiden was the most common portrayal of an actual female soldier in a Soviet memorial culture. Harris describes a handmaiden as follows. She's a nurturing and sexually attractive female character who completes a male character. She serves in a non-violent capacity, usually as a nurse, radio operator, or translator. In keeping with the traditional male gaze, her body is of paramount interest, and the reader always knows what she looks like, but not always what she thinks. This archetype's undertone is present in almost every representation of contemporary female soldiers when the narrator is someone else than the female soldiers herself. The discourse of Handmaiden draws a sad picture of widespread, constant sexism in Russian military. For example, the Russian military holds 4 different beauty contests for female soldiers every year. Femininity is at the center of this portrayal. The often repeated story about the female flying aces in the Second World War tells how difficult it was for female soldiers to cut their hair and how they decorated their costumes and planes to be more feminine. The same narrative of pure and happy young girls in the military still exists. Russian studies have shown that female soldiers use a dual behavioral strategy to cope in the military. In formal interactions, women display masculine military professional qualities, and in the informal setting, they activate feminine qualities. This is a contradictory structure. Women need to know boundaries of wanted and unwanted femininity, while these boundaries can also change over time. But giving up feminine qualities does not seem to be possible either, as women will always be treated primarily as women in the Russian military. The descriptions of female soldiers lack imagery associated with male soldiers, such as aggression, courage, fighting spirit, ability to kill or sacrifice. The compilation of praising and mystifying feminine qualities and lack of hard masculine qualities legitimize women's supportive positions and routine tasks. Martyr. In the picture is Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, the most famous martyr in war memorial culture. She was executed by the Nazis at the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, after she became a propaganda star for Soviet regime. Martyrs are central to Russian cultural memory, and in recent years their use in propaganda has accelerated. Last year Zoya got a new museum and new statues dedicated for her. According to Harris, in Soviet memorial culture, the female martyr was described as a model citizen, intensely patriotic and loyal. She is a combination of the ordinary and extraordinary. Often her ordinariness as a child is stressed, followed by a physical transformation into a heroic militarized woman. She differs from male martyrs in her innocence and purity. Although actual martyrs are not widely represented in my material, these narratives of an ordinary childhood and physical transformation are. I argue that the absolute portrayal of the martyr is not needed yet, or today, in the same way it was used in the mobilization for the Great Patriotic War. However, the basis of the martyr exists in portrayals of Handmaiden, a female warrior, from which it can be quickly formulated. Female warrior. This portrayal is produced by women themselves. For some female veterans who participated in the Second World War, motivation to join the war was deeply personal. They saw themselves as military professionals in the centuries-long tradition of female warriors, familiar with Slavic folklore. By their memories, they tried to widen the narrow male-centered official memorial culture. The portrayal of the female warrior is seen in my material in answers when journalists ask something and female soldiers make their voices heard. I did not find many references to Slavic female warriors or the Great Patriotic War in women's own stories, but I think the modern female soldier fits this archetype. This archetype questions the patriarchal military culture and gender roles, and her gender-neutral behavioral normalizes women's membership in the military. As seen in the quote above, female warriors still produce alternative descriptions of the war. Modern female warriors are brave enough to disclose discriminations in the military, although in my material this happens mainly between the lines. They have criticized, for example, the gendered language in the military and told of their difficulties with male officers. Krasnäsvesa's journalist tends to frame female soldiers' difficulties as individual survival stories, like how it was difficult with men at first, but now everything is fine. I think this narrative naturalizes and normalizes the fact that women need still and constantly redeem their place in the military. I would like to think that this portrayal represents a contemporary, so-called normal woman who wants to be first of all the military professional, not the gender. I also believe that there are more of these female warriors in the Russian military, but they are not just represented like that. There is an obvious gap and contradiction between female soldiers' identity and official representations, but this study does not provide answers to how big is the distance between these. Narratives changed during the reviewed period. From 2008 to 2012, Dmitry Medvedev was president and Anatoly Serdyukov as Minister of Defense. Thanks to Serdyukov, the integration of women deepened in these years. He was rumored to be a player who promoted many women to senior positions in the military, who in turn opened the military academies for women first time after the Second World War. Krasnäsvesa's focus in these years was on soft issues, on social and economic challenges of the reform. Promises of socio-economic improvements were largely addressed to mothers and wives, who were a key target group in restoring the military's reputation. There were also a lot of writings about the Chechen and Afghanistan war's sad results. Widows told their stories. These stories disappeared later, which I think is related to that the Ministry of Defense abolished publishing data on killed and dead soldiers in 2010. the subject became taboo. But in summary, narratives and topics were more extensive and critical in these early years. In 2012, Vladimir Putin became a president and Sergei Shoigu as the Minister of Defense. In those years, patriotism as a state ideology was invented. This was reflected in my material in calls for women to take responsibility for the patriotic education of the next generations. And naturally, it meant strengthening the portrayal of Rodina Maat. Writings on the deeds of women in the Great Patriotic War expanded, and many exhibitions and statues were built up, but they were strictly within the limits of the heroic frame. The military's perception of femininity was introduced to the public in 2017 when female soldiers marched first time in the Victory Day parade in high heels. Military leaders said back then that the whole world saw that the modern Russian army is not only powerful and polite, but also beautiful. Female soldiers were also, and are, in Syria. Krasnaya Zvezda reported that they were there to help children, women, elderly people, and ordinary peaceful Syrians. This is a classic representation of weak feminine victims and women as a non-violent pacifist, even they are soldiers. In his Women's Day speech in 2018, Sergei Shoigu first thanked the mothers of the soldiers, then the wives of the military personnel, and only lastly the female military personnel. I think this is a marching order of militarized women in Russia today. So, what do these very stereotypic and gendered narratives serve? Portrayals draw on existing cultural norms and structural inequalities and reinforce them. They show how militarism has far-reaching gendered effects. Despite women's opportunities and career prospects having extended in the Russian military, stereotypical narratives and practices support military masculinity, repeat women's positions as others, and legitimize their supportive work. Representations of women create the generalized image that all women share naturally the same feminine gender expression. In other words, gender fully reflects the anatomical sex. Presented sexual orientations follow the heterosexual norms. There are no alternatives. Identities given to female soldiers are narrow. It was not a surprise that sexual harassment is a complete taboo in the Russian armed forces. Anyway, as said before, representations do not match female soldiers' identities. Therefore, this study tells more about the means of propaganda than about female soldiers themselves. The strong association of motherhood with female soldiers tells us that women are not needed as soldiers. However, the concept of motherhood can be distinguished, if needed, from the representation of female soldiers, as happened at the dawn of the Second World War. The study showed how the Russian armed forces utilized gendered narratives and gave an idea of what are the roles of women during militarization and war in Russia. So, thank you, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them later, and I'd be happy to receive any comments also. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonna. Maybe a short, quick question.
Okay.
That was really fascinating, and we will come back to your research in the discussion session, but I'd like to ask you that, was there anything like truly surprising that because you went through a lot of material on the Russian newspapers on this topic, so was there something like really surprising that you didn't expect to see?
Not really. I think this study kind of supported my hypothesis of sexism in a Russian military. Yeah, maybe that was surprising that I was thinking that I will find more like emancipation discourses, but there were not so much of that. But yeah, and maybe surprising was that motherhood is really within the female soldiering.
Yeah, that's an interesting finding.
Yeah, like because the Krasnaya Zvezda is a military newspaper, I was thinking that their narratives about female soldiers really tell about female soldiers, but no, it was more about the women in broader context.
Yeah, but maybe that is somehow related also to that specific newspaper. But I think we continue this discussion on the data and your findings. So thanks a lot, Jonna. That was a great start for our session. And then we go to the second paper, second presentation, that is by Aristide Lagay, and it's about Russian military power projection through spiritual power. Admiral Uchakov's representations of him, his sainthood. So again, we have approximately 30 minutes, and please, floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon. My name is Aristide Lagay. I am a visual information scientist. What is a visual information scientist? I look at the creation, transmission, and preservation of visual information. My specialty is Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. I also served as a strategic communications officer in the US Army for 10 years, most of that time spent in Europe. My most recent research focuses on the archiving of oppositional visual culture during the 2020 Belarusian presidential election. Today I will be introducing research that I am still developing, speaking on the topic of visual information and cultural power projection, specifically Russian military and spiritual power projection via the image of Admiral Fyodorovich Uchiko. A short introduction. Uchiko was born in 1745 into a military family. He attended the Naval Cadet Training in St. Petersburg, and after serving as a midshipman in the Baltic Fleet, he transferred to the Don Azov flotilla, and then to the Black Sea Fleet, where he spent most of his career. Uchiko distinguished himself in the Russian-Turkish Wars and was Catherine the Great's military governor and head of the Admiralty in Crimea in 1783, eventually becoming the garrison commander of Sevastopol in the Black Sea Fleet. After the Mediterranean campaigns of 1794 and 1800, he returned to St. Petersburg and served on the headquarters staff and as commander of the Joint Forces Baltic Fleet before becoming head of the Russian Imperial Navy. Uchikov is known for being a skilled tactician, creating and updating naval doctrine, and for being undefeated in battle. After Catherine's reign and then Paul's, Alexander I had very little interest in Uchikov, and the last 7 years of the admiral's career were unpleasant. He didn't very much care for staff work. And so he retired in 1807 to Tambov, located in present-day Mordovia. It was during his retirement that he was asked to return to duty for the Patriotic War of 1812, but instead funded and built hospitals for wounded veterans. He died in 1817. Uchikov was rehabilitated in the 1940s by Stalin and was later canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church in 2001 as a local saint of the Saransk Eparchy. This last bit of information might be surprising for some. How could a career military serviceman be named a saint? Well, the hagiographers have written that after having his heart broken as a young lieutenant, Uchikov decided to devote 100% of his energy to his troops, their families, the Navy, and Queen and country. He is reported to have spent his pay on troop welfare and was especially documented during his time in Crimea. He gave his pension to wounded veterans in the local monastery. Peter Kirill said Uchiko was known for his modesty, self-sacrifice, and a real love for his troops. During the Mediterranean campaign, he was also known as liberator and defender of Christians. Hagiographer Valery Ganachov said that Uchiko was canonized not for his military heroism, as that isn't enough for canonization, but for the way he managed to convey the image of a true Christian in conditions of battle, serving his day on the front lines, yet always ready to sacrifice his life for others. And this is why his memory lived among the people. I have a short video.
Адмирал Ушаков не только военный герой. Чем же он знаменит? Первую награду он получил за эффективную борьбу с чумой в Херсоне, а еще прославился тем, что не проиграл ни одного сражения. Освободив остров Корфу, он помог возродить независимое греческое государство и даже помог написать его конституцию. Ушаков не потерял ни одного корабля, ни один его матрос не попал в плен. Адмирал был знаменит особой заботой о солдатах. Занимался устройством госпиталей и удобных казарм. В отставке поселился рядом с Санаксарским монастырем. Здесь похоронен его дядя, преподобный Феодор Санаксарский. Ушаков уделял много времени молитве и чтению Евангелия. Во время войны с Наполеоном открыл госпиталь, сиротский приют, вооружил Тамбовское ополчение. За праведную жизнь, милосердие и глубокую веру адмирал Ушаков причислен к лику святых.
Käytätkö näitä korvavahapoistoa? Hankkiudu niistä eroon heti pakkaussiivaa varoitetta.
In 2015, I was a member of the U.S. Army Europe's 173rd Airborne Brigade Detachment embarked on the British Royal Navy warship HMS Ocean in the Baltic Sea for Baltops, the annually recurring multinational exercise designed to increase interoperability of Allied and partner forces in the Baltic region. My job as Strategic Communications Officer was to gather and disseminate information in support of this mission. It was aboard the Ocean that I met first Uchiko. Visiting the ship's library next to St. Michael's Chapel, I was surprised to see a Russian icon hanging in the chapel nave. Who was this haloed man in military uniform, and what was he doing upon a British warship? A frame letter that hung nearby said that the icon was a gift from a group of visiting naval officers. After that experience, images of Uchiko kept popping up. I expected, of course, to find him in St. Petersburg, as he had been educated there and spent most of his career there while not at sea. I saw his image on icons in churches all over the city and his commanding statue at the Kronstadt Naval Cathedral. In naval museums in the northern capital and in Sevastopol, I saw his likeness, heroic poetry, and massive stone busts, as well as personal artifacts. On a pilgrimage, I directly encountered his bodily relics in a carved wooden nautical-themed casket in the Catholicos in the shrine located at Sanaksar Monastery of the Nativity of Theotokos in Timnikov in the Republic of Mordovia. I've yet to visit the Cathedral of St. Theodore, the first of his name located in the Republic's capital Saransk, but I have seen images of the commanding edifice that anchor the city's central square. These places, directly associated with Uchiko, I expected to find him, but it was the places that I did not expect to find him that surprised me. I observed a number of his images in landlocked Moscow, likely a place he never served, but this is perhaps understandable, as it is the capital of the modern Russian Federation. Here we see a metro stop named after him, as well as a decorated metro car in support of the Russian Military History Association, featuring his medal. But what about Brest, Minsk, Odessa, Riga, and of course, a British warship? Uchiko is a pretty distinctive and specific saint. On this slide, I would like to point out iconographic representations of Uchiko. Here we see the two more canonical examples, center and right, found in Brest and Edessa. Generally, Uchiko is presented in full naval uniform with a sword or telescope, the accoutrements for a naval officer. Often he is carrying a scroll that says, "Не отчевайтесь, si grozny буря бряться к слава Россия," sometimes in Russian and other times in Slavonic. This phrase translates, "Do not despair, these terrible storms will turn to the glory of Russia." I'd like to point out that the two icons in the left and center are in Belarus, but versions of this icon can be seen all over the Russian world. The icon on the left is about 3 meters tall and is located in the Catholicos of the Monastery of St. Elizabeth in Minsk, and can be seen here paired with St. Alexander Nevsky. Again, another very specific Russian military saint. So, what information is being transmitted here to the Belarusian worshiper, the visitor, the nuns? What can they possibly understand from this image? And again, it isn't a very, very specific and high place. It's seen by everyone. It's my belief that the official promoters of Russian culture, the Troika of church, military, and political leaders, are actively using the image of Uchiko as a tool for soft power projection in order to propagate an example of their ideal Russian, who is a righteous Orthodox warrior. And also the centrality of Moscow in the Orthodox world. I feel we must understand Uchiko's role in the Russian hybrid warfare if we can understand the military religious culture. In my studies, I'm using the framework of Yuri Lotman in the Tartu Moscow Semiotic School, especially looking at artistic information in the semiotics of culture. I'll show how Russia uses his image for cultural power projection, analyzing visual aspects of Russian information operations in the ever-changing Russian infosphere. Semiotics is a cultural meta-language that allows for the unification of different structures of visual culture, theology, military science, and war studies. One of the foundation understandings of the Tartu school is the semiotic system, the function of which is the modeling of the world. Natural languages such as Finnish, Russian, English are a group's primary modeling systems, and they give members of a group a sense of their cultural structure. Secondary modeling systems are extra-linguistic science systems that groups use to construct cultural texts that mediate information, such as music, dance, and in this instance, religious art. The semiotics of culture is the study of these secondary modeling systems. Russian hagiographic and military texts cannot be studied in isolation, and thus it is necessary to determine their place within the Russian world and its cultural system. So why am I here at a military conference speaking about art? Well, art is a communicative system, what Lotman called the highest incarnation of culture. Art serves as a modeling system that can organize and create the way we see the world and create our reality. And it is distinct and perhaps the universal method for analyzing different cultures of the world. American military doctrine also recognizes the importance of visual information as one of the most powerful tools available for informing domestic audiences and influencing foreign audiences. The majority of my observed examples are religious icons, but the cult of Uchiko is also being supported by the state, with numerous military, educational, and community groups that bear his name. For example, events like the Uchiko Youth Olympiads held at state schools in partnership with local military and religious officials. And here we see state-sponsored icons. These philatelic examples are powerful tools that communicate national ideas both inside Russian borders and outside them. Most Uchiko philately is from Russia alone, but I wanted to share this interesting clip, as Uchiko, again, seemingly does not belong in this space, the Dnestr Moldovan Republic. And we can see the church and government working in tandem. Stamps are a form of official texts, And here we have a foreign government with no relation to Uchiko issuing stamps and broadcasting it within the church.
Полководец великий русский, который защищал свою отчизну, свою землю, на самом деле является примером и доброго христианина, еще и ни разу не проигравшего битву. Человеком, подающим пример любому из нас, как мы должны сражаться не с внешним просто с врагом, а внутренним.
В кафедральном
Since his canonization in 2001, numerous visual representations, including churches, memorials, statues, stamps, and icons, have proliferated not only in Russia, but throughout the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and the Russian world. Recent state-funded additions include 3 images in the main cathedral of the Russian Armed Forces, finished in 2020, and in a wooden military chapel built in 2018, and a newer 2020 memorial at the Russian Navy logistics base in Tartu, Syria. Soviet films introduced many to Uchiko. In fact, Peter Kryl, at the blessing of a new church dedicated to St. Fyodor in the Moscow region, mentioned that he was fascinated by the actions of this man, and it was the first color film he saw. Modern documentaries produced by military and religious broadcasters continue to bring the word to a new generation to be wowed and amazed by Uchikov's undefeated military record, piousness, and patriotism. That 1-minute clip that we saw earlier can be found on TikTok. That's where I found it, on TikTok. I bought this prayer book for Orthodox soldiers at a bookstore in Moscow. It features a triptych of Saint Michael the Archangel, patron of paratroopers, Saint George, patron of the Russian army, and our holy righteous warrior, patron of the Russian Navy nuclear forces. At the same bookstore, I was able to find a variety of children's books and thick tomes such as the one picture. Recent Russian language academic literature about Uchiko focuses on his role in military culture, especially themes of patriotism, morality, and the spiritual development of military personnel. Other research lists Uchiko as the source for all military diplomatic activities and defines Russia's place in international affairs, especially in Crimea, the Black Sea, and the Balkans. Others highlight Uchikov's useful position in the pantheon for Russian military saints as it relates to the development of contemporary Orthodox culture in the Russian armed forces. Patriotism, along with politics, war, and international relations, are all written into the Russian Orthodox Church social catechism, basis of the social concept of the Russian Orthodox Church. And it is suggested that religious patriotism is a sacred duty for all Orthodox Christians who are called to follow the path of the holy saints before them in their love for and dedication to the fatherland. While there is certainly a push to increase spiritual life in Russia, there's another type of practice targeting not so religious adherence to what Helsinki researcher Elena Kovala in her 2016 Third Rome Today State Church Collaborations in Contemporary Russia defines as cultural rather than religious orthodoxy, which is the embedding of national ideas into symbols which manifest themselves in memory politics and cultural production. Uchiko is generally unknown outside Russia, even to Russians. I bet if we could take a poll in here, that would also be reflected. An English language literature review noted very little and nothing recent. Just a few mention in Russia's Mediterranean campaigns, his connection to Crimea, with most citations referring to the Russian or Soviet warships named after him. Additionally, the admiral's name often appears in the English language media sphere relating to the presentation of the Uchiko Medal to foreign service members, often for their service in the Arctic convoys. The Russian embassy in London recently released that the medal has been awarded to more than 8,000 foreigners. There are also popular media reports of his sainthood, its application as the patron saint of nuclear bombers, and also religious and cultural media, including those financed by the Russian state and Orthodox evangelicists. there is much active and recent Russian language scholarship on Uchikov's place in contemporary military and religious society, and yet he remains invisible to those outside Russia. I put forth, in order to understand the religious dimension of patriotism that drives Russian policy, we must know and understand Uchikov. And to connect to an earlier presentation, in order to understand Russia, we must have Russian cultural literacy. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we all agree warmly with your closing remark on need to understand the larger cultural sphere. I would like to have just a quick question before we will return back to your excellent presentation in the discussion. So Uchiko was canonized in early 2000, but could you kind of say when are there turning points, or are there, what kind of dynamism is there with all the kind of artifacts or the kind of visual images that you have traced along in different countries? But could we say that there are certain years after which there are more and more use made of him in the Russian sort of military context?
Well, what's interesting is, again, he wasn't canonized as a saint in the larger Orthodox Church, but as what's called a local saint, which means that he can be celebrated in the Saransk eparchy, so most of Mordovia. And yet, this local saint has worldwide followers and attractions. And it was, his cult was officially started about 5 years prior to 2001, but there was much discussion about at least in the beginning, about the appropriateness of this. Because he is the only modern, I say modern meaning 19th century, he's the only modern military saint in the Orthodox world. The other, I pointed out, St. Michael the Archangel and St. George are from 2,000 years ago. So it certainly is very interesting. And the cult was started a lot by actually naval officers, and one specifically a naval captain assigned to the academy who was very devout and pious. And then he worked with a local civilian to help develop the documents needed for this process. And it was really after 2001, they planned a nationwide celebration. They carried his relics by foot into all the various places that he was known for, and starting in Yaroslavl, but then hitting places like St. Petersburg and Kronstadt. And at this, all the troops were mandated there. So you'll see all these celebrations. You have all these naval cadets, and you have all these other troops who are there. So from the very beginning, once it was approved, it was 100% full power on. Okay. And I feel that it's been that way since 2001. And because I think someone recognized very early on. Mm-hmm. And again, the church was against it in the early parts of the canonization. But this was a very politically influenced decision, and also from very powerful lay members as well. And the church just eventually decided, okay. But then, of course, they realized how it would work to benefit them.
Okay, this is so fascinating, but I think we will return back to these issues in the discussion section. Thank you so much for your presentation. And then we have the last, but definitely not least, speech for this evening here, and it's by our very own Santeri Kytoneva, who is a research assistant at our Russia research group, and has written a research paper on Gareyev's concept of spiritual security, and now Santeri is also widening the original research question. So title of his presentation is Justifying the Use of Force, Russia's Spiritual and National Security. So Santeri, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for having me here. It's been a very long day here at the Russia seminar, and I'm hoping to provide some inspiring new venues for future research. So, as Katri said, I'm a research intern at the Finnish National Defense University for the past five months. And the topic of my talk is spiritual security and its relation to justifying the application of military power in Russian context. And as noted, as a source material, I will mainly consider Mahmoud Gareyev's articles written on the topic and published in Russian military science journals. And I will also consider very briefly 3 types of Russia's strategic planning documents: the national strategy, the doctrine on information security, and the military doctrine. And this seminar, as I said, builds on research I conducted in the previous fall, where the focus was on tracing the genealogy of the concept of spiritual security. And the structure of the presentation is the following. Next, I will consider the definition of spirituality and spiritual security. I will ground these concepts in the earlier mentioned official documents, which will allow us to understand the ways in which spirituality is framed. Thirdly, I will present and evaluate a categorization given by Tor Buchwald 11 years ago, and I will develop it in the context of state security and put forward a hypothesis that the dominant view in current debates regarding spiritual security is one of the traditionalists. And fourthly, I will consider the way in which these spiritual factors can possibly be used in order to justify the application of military power. And I believe these concluding remarks will be useful in moving on into the following panel discussion. So here are the 3 main arguments of my presentation, which I will elaborate on shortly. So firstly, I argue that the spirituality as a concept is gaining further importance in Russia's strategic planning documents and practical measures. Secondly, traditionalists, who I argue dominate the current debate on issues of spiritual security, argue for further centralized state control. And I will define the characteristics of traditionalist thought soon. And thirdly, I will argue that spirituality and spiritual factors can be connected to justifying the application of military force for both the citizens and the soldiers. And the aim here is to elaborate on the logic underlying the justification of the use of force, opening new venues for further research. So firstly, we shall begin with the concept of spirituality very briefly. So spirituality as a concept remains elusive. It can be approached from an individual experience felt of a connection towards a great idea and greater ideals. However, the focus of this presentation will be on the group-centric and state-defined spirituality and its usage in possibly justifying certain measures. And the concept of spiritual security The focus here will be on spiritual security, duhovная безопасность, which is a concept that Gareev has used in his publications on the topic in Russian military scientific journals. It is therefore a concept upon which some theoretical debate can be found in the Russian military scientific community. And here I have demarcated two levels of spiritual security in order to clarify it. So at the state level, it means maintaining unity in certain ideas of great importance, so securing the spiritual foundation. And at the level of the individual soldier, it can mean maintaining high morale and readiness to self-sacrifice. And at this level, it is a feature of Russian strategic culture with long roots in past wars spanning over decades. The Russian soldier is often presented as extremely persistent and in spiritual strength superior to the competition. So spiritual security, summarizing, it is about maintaining collective unity and maintaining the morality of the soldier. So moving on into the strategic planning documents. As mentioned, I will briefly consider three. And much analysis has been done on these documents for good reasons. Now I will strictly focus on the content of spirituality as is presented in these. We shall begin at the broadest level, looking at the national strategy. In the 2021 released version of the document, there is an entire section devoted to spiritual and moral values. And moving on next to the doctrine on information security, we can observe the following. The doctrine which defines Russia's national interest in the information sphere also notes that the corruption of Russian spiritual values is a threat in the information sphere. And the military doctrine thirdly lists activities undermining spiritual and patriotic traditions as an internal threat. And on the basis of these documents, we can note that maintaining certain level of spirituality is a national interest of the Russian Federation. And active measures are required to defend these national interests. And this logic I will return on later. And in the doctrine on information security and Gareev's articles, we can observe the following conceptual hierarchy. So information security is part of the larger national security, but interesting to highlight is that information security, spiritual security is often defined as a part of the information security. And for example, Gareev in his writings has noted that information security should not focus strictly on the technical issues, but also on the more human aspects of security. And I will use this conceptual hierarchy to put forward a categorization. But before moving on to this, and in order to explain the underlying thinking in these documents, I will return to the aforementioned classification of Russian military terrorists. So in his article, Tor Buchwald categorized Russian military terrorists into three schools of thought: traditionalist, modernist, and revolutionaries. Now, Buchwald presented this categorization in the context of military technological resource allocation and its relation to personal resources in the army. And in this presentation, the context is quite different, so this is important to keep in mind. However, something that remains the same is that the traditionalists and modernists believe that the nature of war remains fundamentally unchanged regardless of technical developments. And traditionalists highlight that new technology should not come at the expense of manpower. However, modernists value reallocation of resources in some cases to technology. And the revolutionaries believe in the fundamental change in the nature of war that comes with these developments of new technologies. So now, in the context of this presentation, I will extend this categorization into a debate on state security and issues of spiritual security, and I will aim to offer a positive definition to traditionalists. My argument is that traditionalists desire stricter state-controlled implementation of spiritual security, and that traditionalists recognize the need for spiritual security as a separate domain of national security. Now, non-traditionalist thinkers, on the other hand, do not necessarily desire stricter control and therefore also do not see the need to conceptualize and develop measures regarding spiritual security. Now, traditionalists, which I will aim a positive definition of right now, can be characterized by the following assumptions. Firstly, traditionalists see the role of state as critical and undeniable in building and strengthening ideology. And this is a viewpoint repeated by Gareev, Ilyin, and Uryupin, for example. Gareev repeatedly stresses in his writings the need for a separate state organ in handling issues of spiritual security. A strong state is seen as necessary by the traditionalist, and this is closely related to the next theoretical assumption, which is ideological unity. Now, traditionalists see the absence of ideology as a harmful state of matters, and the underlying reasoning behind this is that an ideological void will most likely be filled from the outside, and it could be filled possibly with anti-Russian content, and therefore, without a collective national idea, the traditionalists see perceived threats such as color revolutions and globalization undermining Russian values as actualizing further. Both of these threats are seen as driven from the outside and harmful to Russian spiritual values. Now, traditionalists seek to uphold a strong collective ideological unity in order to combat these issues raising from possible state of ideological void. And thirdly, protecting the memory of past wars. The role of history in strengthening the moral of soldiers and citizens is central, as illuminated by the earlier presentation on Admiral Uchiko. Traditionalists emphasize the history and memory of past wars. As one example to bring up, which has also been brought up before, is the Great Patriotic War. In the matter of past wars, traditionalists highlight the role of the veterans' stories and see great importance in transmitting these teachings forward. In his book, Gregory Carlton, in the book Russia's The Story of War, Gregory Carlton presents the story of the Great Patriotic War as one with significant strength in building unity between the Russian people. The story is told that the people of Russia are matched up against the great evil and forced to fight it in order to bring back the good into the world. And the Russians, although suffering great sacrifices, succeed in this. The war still plays a great role in defining our collective identity through sacrifices made and ultimately Russia defeating evil forces. And this narrative is almost framed as a holy life, so it is required to defend on heresies on many fronts. And this story of war, as one example, plays a great role in building a uniting spiritual foundation. And it is seen, for example, as one idea by the traditionalists too strong to give up on, an idea uniting the people to the land that signifies the meaning of spiritual over material, a viewpoint also written down in the most recent national strategy. And fourthly, protecting Russian values. Gareev, Ilyin, and Uryupin frame globalization and the spread of Western values as one threat to Russian spiritual values. Ilyin and Uryupin, in their very recent article, return to Soviet times in idealizing manners of certain measures regarding patriotic education. So traditionalists highly value collective unity regarding a national idea and therefore also certain measures of control. And increasing the need for patriotic education is something that the traditionalist thinkers desire. And also noteworthy is that the Russian tradition, according to Kareyev, for example, is something unique and special, that a feature that needs to be protected and saved. Now, summarizing these assumptions, traditionalists aim for deep unity in a national idea built on collective values. State-controlled ideology is justified through history and the perceived greater good in enhancing and protecting a certain idea of Russia. And this idea of Russia is deeply intertwined in past wars and the struggle of the soldiers and citizens who fought in them. It also lends itself to framing foreign forces as enemy images. And I argue that traditionalists stand for stricter control and active measures on issues of state security. And it seems to me, as of right now, that many of the mechanisms that they desire underlie the logic of measures from Soviet times. However, it is in contemporary time with a specific focus on Russian Orthodox Christianity and patriotism. And traditionalists highlight the role that morality of the soldiers plays in the outcomes of war and success at the individual level. And the contemporary end result is a stricter control with specific focus on Russian Orthodox Christianity and state-defined patriotism, as highlighted by the earlier two presentations. Now, ensuring spiritual security, according to traditionalists, requires active measures, for example, in the production of historical education material, controlling harmful media, and controlling controversial views, especially on the topic of past wars. Now we shall move on to the topic of justifying the use of force. And firstly, we should return to Mahmoud Karev's logic underlying the application of military power. The logic is simple as follows. Use of military power is justified on the basis of a sovereign state defending its national interest. Now, a key question I would like to raise is on the contents of this national interest. And what kind of violation of national interest is great enough to justify the use of force? And now, defining a key threshold, in theory, it is extremely difficult. However, this is a topic I would like to raise for discussion and further studies. Can harmful interference to patriotic values and Russia's spiritual values be interpreted as a violation of national interest that requires defending? And now, what I have conceptualized in this presentation as spiritual security is closely related to certain state-enforced ideas with ideological priority. The content of these ideas is built in accordance with state leaders, the armed forces, and the church enjoying mutual respect. And strengthening these ideas is important for justifying the use of force, both for the citizens and the soldiers. And spiritual security is developed in accordance with the national security. And the main sphere of logic from which the usage of force can possibly be justified is the requirement to defend national interest. And spiritual factors are especially interesting in this line of thought due to them being in contact with ideas seen as holy and undeniable. And with them comes the ability to justify different measures and control. And now, complicated issues of defining the actual content of spirituality and threshold for the application of military power in extreme cases remain great challenges. However, unity is maintained on the spiritual front on the basis of certain unchallenged spiritual foundations and centralized control. And as concluding remarks of my presentation, I would like to mention the following. 11 years after Thor Buchwald published his article, it seems that traditionalists still hold the dominant view within many topics on the debate regarding military scientific issues, one of which being that of spiritual security. And the growing role of spirituality is highlighted in the recent Russian national strategy and active theoretical debate on the topic, and measures on patriotic education, for example. And the future may hold even stricter policies on activities that are seen as harmful to Russian spiritual values. And now, traditionalists seek an ideal that is united and resilient state where interests are shared between the leaders and the population. Now, answers to threats corrupting this unity between the people and the state lead are seen by the traditionalists as centralizing control. And therefore, traditionalists see it as critical for state security to maintain a strong government and a strong spiritual base. Thank you.
Thank you, Santeri. That was really super interesting. My quick question before we open the floor to everybody else. You mentioned that non-traditionalists also have sort of reconceptualized the spiritual security concept. So, can you just very briefly, who are these non-traditionalists?
Well, I would actually see that the non-traditionalists, so far I haven't done much work on defining this school of thought, but they actually would not possibly use the concept of spiritual security because they do not see great importance possibly in it.
Okay, that was just a kind of definition that I was looking for. So please, Jonna, I see that. Please come here. I'll probably sit.
Yes, so
sit here.
We can sit here in row.
And then maybe we should work so that if you from the audience have a question, you can also come here in a way so that it can be heard better. And immediately I would like to give floor to Dima, please, and then we proceed along that way.
First of all,
please come here so that you are visible.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's fine, as long as there are people see me. So, first of all, Jonna and Aristide, I'm sorry for being forced to leave back and forth. These were just phone calls and personal issues. I'm sorry about that. But I got the beginning of your presentation and the end of yours, Aristide. So I have questions to all three of you. Jonna, I will start with you, if you please. I think I got the main argument. You put it up front in the beginning. My question is about the flip side of this argument. As I'm sure you know, in youth army, there is a very strong emphasis on young ladies also going to more combat positions. Also, in the military itself, you also have a tendency in certain services like airport troops or naval infantry, that are sort of considered to be very combat-oriented positions, to put women in some combat positions and also to publicize it. You even have RT sort of short movies showing it. So I would be just very interested to comment how it correlates with this trend that you presented. So this is the question to you. Aristide, to you, again, we discussed yesterday a little bit, and again, I got the main argument. My question is, why do you emphasize Saint Uchiko? Although you made it clear and you differentiate him from the older or more traditional saints, but I would be very curious to understand why you sort of isolate him, for example, from Alexander Nevsky, or from Saint Alexander Nevsky, or from Saint Ilya the Prophet, and from, let's say, Ilya Muromets, who are all canonized, and they are also saint patrons. So, and in general, if you can just situate him, Saint Uchiko, in the pantheon of Russian military saints, and to what extent it matters. Or maybe you are just focusing on him because he's underexplored, or it's an underexplored major phenomenon. And thank you again for your presentation. And Santuri, thank you for your talk. Actually, my question is exactly a follow-up on Katri's. It will be very interesting to hear your even sort of basic take on these revolutionaries, those who are, if we were using Torah Buchwald's typology, are not emphasizing the soft issues of security. As you definitely know, and all the previous sessions illustrated it very well, there was a very strong emphasis, actually simultaneous emphasis in Russian professional discourse and practice on traditionalists, but also there is a very strong emphasis on revolutionaries, those who are putting stress on emerging technologies, AI, C4, and if you're looking at modernization trends in Russian military, you actually see how both are. So the question is whether you see a pushback, whether you see some discussions, to what extent you think these two trends of security can coexist, to what extent they're mutually exclusive, where they're mutually exclusive. By the way, it goes directly to the question discussed in the previous sessions on informational psychological security as opposed to informational technological security. So I think it is definitely something that is happening within the information war and cyber war, but maybe you have more thoughts on that. And thank you again, Mr.
Thank you so much. So we go in the order of questions. So Jonna.
Yeah, thank you for the question. There is a lot of girls in Yun Armia, for example, but I believe that majority of those girls, they wanted to be those patriotic mothers, and maybe some of them continue to the army, mostly to the supportive posts, I believe. But there are also individual women who have got these command positions and so on. But for example, Putin has said that if some woman wants some kind of extraordinary position in the military, one should consult with higher authorities. So I think it's a little bit propaganda machine also. Put women. It's a kind of artificial. How can I say this? Maybe it's a propaganda, and it's kind of they use some means of feminism and equality to show that okay, we have this kind of army, but it's not the whole truth. To put just some individuals on the front.
So I will follow up to that. I watched that entire VDV miniseries about the women, and initially it got me. I was like, we finally have some equality. But then about halfway through, they have one of these pageants. And first it started off with rifle qualification, so I thought maybe this was just a normal military competition, because everybody does that. And there was also a physical fitness test. But guess what event 3 was? Cooking.
Yeah.
I have never been asked to cook in my military career. And also, if you look at some of the things that that show focused on, they also did want to emphasize the femininity and the cuteness of the girls, because times together they would show them after work with their berets off, but what were they talking about? They were talking about makeup and boys. And I'm trying to understand if you're trying to show me professional soldiers, but it didn't seem like that to me. But it got me initially, but then I just noticed it was the normal everyday mishmash. You asked me why I emphasize Uchiko and not perhaps like the Prophet Elias or Saint Alexander Nevsky or perhaps Patriotic. Well, what are the differences? I cannot identify with the Prophet Elias. I also cannot identify with Patriotic because I'm not a monk, and obviously I'm not the Grand Prince of Kiev either. But what I am is a soldier, or what I was as a soldier. And I feel that this is also the key. It's identification. So there are no normal, what hagiographers call saints with shoulder straps, or saints with epaulets. And these are the ones who are real military soldiers that we can see representations of. There aren't any photos of him or anything. But the difference is he is an actual soldier. He was a soldier his whole life. And the people seeing these icons can identify. As a soldier, I can identify with another soldier. So of course, these are going to be... I was also a paratrooper, but St. Michael the Archangel, there's nothing that I can personally identify with. But certainly with a living, breathing soldier, it makes that a whole lot easier.
Elina, if you want to continue on the same topic,
yes,
and then we go to
the
something.
same topic, yes, maybe to pose my question.
And you can also...
it is to, okay, yes, I will come there. This goes for Aristide. Have you been looking at the possibility that maybe Ushakov is representative, especially for the Navy?
I think he identifies more with the Navy, but that picture in Brest is from the Garrison Army Church.
Yeah.
So again, yes, he's more the patron of the Navy, and of course sailors and Marines can identify more with him, and yes, he is overrepresented in Navy towns, but then I'm also finding him in non-Navy places. So like I said, Odessa, Harshal, I understand. Sevastopol, Riga is maybe a stretch, but these are all Navy towns, Kronstadt, St. Petersburg. But he, I feel, has grown beyond just the naval cult. And I think the naval cult started because he was one of us. But I think it has gone beyond that by now.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Do you think that he has a competition?
No. So I know they tried to, they've been really trying to canonize that conscript who was killed in the South. But that the church has said no. And in fact, they have issued orders to stop because they have found unofficial icons in churches of this young soldier. And the church has been like, stop, don't do it. So he has no competitors because again, he's the only contemporary military saint we have.
Well, yes. Yeah, if you take the 18th century as contemporary, but
Right.
yes, that's
The-
right. Yeah.
The most
thank you.
recent.
No,
Yeah.
Aristide, you're absolutely right. Just to strengthen your own argument, the earliest possible approximation to him would be Alexander Nevsky, but Alexander Nevsky, citing you to yourself, he's not a regular soldier, he's the prince. He's the prince, the warrior, and if you're looking for someone lower, closer to you, so yes, this would be the closest historically, and also closest in terms of the chains of command, so yes, absolutely so.
Benny started as a 16-year-old midshipman and went from the very bottom rank. Actually, in school, he was a petty officer, and then after he finished his training, of course, midshipman, and then he rose throughout the ranks to the very head of the Navy. So,
Good. Victoria, do you have on the same issue?
No.
No. So then we go in the order of the first question.
Firstly, before I forget, I would like to also propose a question to Aristide. You mentioned TikTok, and I was curious, what do you think is the target audience, for example, on this platform? Like, does Uchiko also apply to these very young people, and what kind of young people, possibly?
they're trying to. And so going into bookstores, and there's even graphic novels and comic books now, a lot of the literature is either very thick hagiographic text, historical text, or children's literature. The majority of accessible literature on Uchiko is mostly historical, but most of it is for children. So these are religious-oriented children's books, military-oriented children's books, and quite often a melange of both.
Now, to return to Dima's question, first of all, thank you very much for the question, and it's been a pleasure to participate and follow this lively debate in the earlier morning sessions as well. And my view right now on the topic is that they can coexist with traditionalists focusing on issues that are not mainly considered by the revolutionaries. But this is definitely a topic I would like to research further, but this is my view right now. And also I would like to highlight that it's kind of important to set a time frame or for your material. Like I've analyzed Kareev's articles from year 2004 to 2011 mainly. So this is a narrow scope sort of. So it needs to be considered like what kind of material you have to set these trends, but it is a very interesting topic and very interesting to see how it could also develop in the opposite direction of not so strict control on these issues. But right now I see them as coexisting.
Thank you. And now, Victoria, your turn, please. You can come here.
Thank you for this very fascinating panel, and I really like how each of the presentations situate each other. Really great. Thank you, guys. So my question is to all of you, because those presentations fit so well into each other. To what extent traditionalism is relevant in the contemporary Russia, and to what extent does it reflect the general sentiment in the society? And as an individual, sort of non-traditionalist individual, I would get the question in my mind along the lines of identity politics. For example, if the state does not allow me to full-fledgedly participate in the defense of the state, can I expect the state to defend me? So, have you seen any allusion to this question within your research, or more from the general knowledge? Thank you.
I think that's a good question, because women's involvement in the military has always been a question of like civil position of women in the country or state. Do we have a right to defend our country? and if we defend our country, maybe state gives us more like rights. But I don't know, but I didn't find any references to this in my material. These female soldiers are quite silenced. It's hard to imagine what they really think about the situation. But I believe there's like more emancipation discourses within the state, but we just don't catch them.
So, on that topic, in 2020, actually on Defenders of the Fatherland Day, I did an analysis on how the Russian and Belarusian armies are defending their women, specifically in relation to military gynecological and midwifery. That analysis was over very quickly because they're not. Unlike the American Army, who has uniform gynecological health in women's officers, the Belarusian military and the Russian military do not. In fact, they must go to their regional clinics for all gynecological health care. So if there are two separate systems, because most of the military health care for the Belarusian and Russian armed forces is for the men. And women are told to go off base and to go to their local neighborhood providers because there are no military medical specialists who focus on women's health care. So I think that will answer very much how the state will defend military women. And the answer is, well, not very much.
Yeah. They protect non-military women.
You have Elena direct.
Maybe not. I have to join now, but I can.
Maybe you can.
Now.
Yeah.
Okay. I forgot to thank you, each of you, for excellent presentations. It was a pleasure to listen to you. Yes, my question is to Jonna, and perhaps it is. I need to introduce my idea first because you said that the true stories of tragedies and harassment and from the real people, living people, they were very quickly silenced, and one was not allowed to talk about that in public. Well, of course, there is the reason of it's the same recipe that there's a strong control of information. Information security maybe is one aspect of that you are not allowed to speak about the negative experiences. But my question is actually about my own experience when I was living in Russia from 2012 until 2016. And during that time I was very, I must say, almost addicted, or I was addicted to watching TV serials. And there were so many intriguing, I went to the cinema theater as well, so I'm talking about movies on the topic of war. As you know, in Russia is the huge producer of historical or non-historical, but films on warfare. So there's on every occasion there is a big production of war films, but many of them are also serialized so that you can watch them at home. And I was thrilled, but I was thinking, how is this possible? How come the amount of violence, and I take as an example, if you have seen Zhensky Battalion.
A little bit.
Yeah,
I'm
it
so addicted, I
tells
couldn't
about female hero and leader of the female battalion from the First World War. And it is full of very heavy violence against the protagonist and the other women as well. And it was a mixture of home violence. Actually, her motivation to join the war was to escape her violent husband. And all that was very open. And yeah. And the other very famous from that time, those years, was Pulemyotchitsa, which is very long serial, and that the main protagonist is also, I must apologize, I don't now remember the word in English for Pulemyotchitsa, who is tarkkaampuja. Sniper, yeah, sniper, yeah. And it is my hypothesis, and I ask, would you perhaps agree with my hypothesis that taboo of the stories is dealt with in through art and in popular culture? Mm-hmm. And if you agree with this, would it be an idea for further article to little bit investigate the film industry on the topic of violence against women and whether women are both subjects and objects?
That's a good point. And maybe my material was like a military media, and I think these things are taboos in that special media output. But yeah, I know there is alternative discourses also and narratives about the female soldiers. Yeah, but in this material it doesn't.
I must say that it is shocking, so nothing is hidden.
Wow. Really interesting, but maybe now we give last voice to Santeri about the Victoria's question.
I was like just looking to like make some connections, because we have been discussing like art and armed forces, and Victoria's question was like the way I see it is like a pragmatic dimension. If it's like a mechanism that works for your target audience, then like the content may not matter as long as it works, like as long as the target audience buys it, sort of deal. Yes, not quite sure if I can get this across, but...
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, good. Jyrki, you had a question, please.
Yeah, thanks for interesting presentations. Sorry, I was able to take part. I didn't hear you on your presentation. I was listening on the fighter jets on the other room. But I wanted to ask you actually, based on the discussion on the Committee of Soldiers' Mothers, because like at some point, or at least I think they had quite a good access to Russian military, and they were able to sort of bring the gender perspective, because there was a lot of these discussions that I think the army was seriously having with the Committee on harassment and that sort of issues that usually go along with that perspective. And on spirituality, I wanted to ask since the Moscow Patriarchy is basically it's like it's bigger than the Russian state in terms of geography. So it's going in many countries in the Eastern Europe and even a bit wider. Like when you talk about this spiritual security, and that maybe might be also a question for you on the because you mentioned that Uchiko was originally a local saint, and it was sort of instructed to be local, but then it spread. Like when would you say that can this spiritual security concept, does it go in the thinking of the traditionalists? Does it go across the Russian borders? Like, does it cover the whole area of the Moscow Patriarchy, or is it confined like to inside of the state of Russia? Yeah.
That's a great question, and now we start with Santeri. So
yeah, this is a really good
have
question,
word.
And I would say that it definitely goes over the borders. And at what level, maybe Aristide can continue. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, on a relevant topic, there are Russian Orthodox military chaplains outside of Russia. We have them in the American Armed Forces, and I believe you also have Orthodox chaplains in your military as well. But there is, the Russian Patriarchy, the Russian Patriarchate has a seat in New York. They are not currently issuing chaplains at the moment, but what they are doing is ROKOR chaplains, since they have the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, has now rejoined the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church proper. ROKOR is the main producing Orthodox chaplains in the United States. So that is certainly very interesting to note.
Yeah, about the mothers of soldiers, they did have access to military discourses, but nowadays they are against. But yeah, they actually used these same gendered narratives to achieve their goals, and they did change practices in the military. But they used them as like we are grieving mothers, and because we are mothers, we have this right to know where our sons are. And so these kind of gendered narratives and Russian women as gendered objects can use these same narratives against the authorities if needed. So it is an interesting case. But yeah, they have done a lot. They have a power also.
That's a really good, and also maybe a kind of connection to I would like to, in the end, in a way, put on the table one big topic that we have Elina Kahla here, who has written into our edited volume on the idea and the concept of sacrifice. But Aristide, you mentioned that this Uchiko was sort of chosen, or it's one of the main features of his life was this him being an ideal for sacrifice. So I would like to ask from you, and this is a question to all of you, but from you first, Aristide, on how this sacrifice is, or this image of him being kind of, that there is this element of sacrifice, how it is represented in the visual material or in other material about him, or how do you find it somehow? And then maybe to also to Jonna, so is there this element of sacrifice somehow in the material? And then of course to Santeri, the same issue that you kind of there is this idea of national interest which is left pretty much undefined in the level of strategies, but then when it's linked to this spiritual security, it must be linked with the idea of sacrifice for the state or for the values or for something. So maybe I'm asking about the ways to study this idea of sacrifice in the future. So this common theme to all of you, and maybe if you start.
Right. Well, I think one of the reasons why Uchiko was canonized is because he lived a life of sacrifice. He never married. He devoted and sacrificed his life, all of his time to the state and to his men and their families. He sacrificed not only his money and his time and his emotional well-being, but during the Mediterranean campaigns, trying to trade for French and Greek prisoners, he often offered himself to be traded, but in the end he was always able to ransom with money. But he was literally ransoming souls, willing to give up his own life in trade for a French Christian. And remember, they were fighting the French in the Mediterranean, but all the Turks wanted to slaughter all the French. But the French were saved because of Uchiko, because he saw them as Christians, even though not Orthodox Christians, they were still Christians. So this idea of sacrifice is very present in certainly the narrative. Is it visually present? It is not. But Lotman said, in order to understand the code, you must speak the language. So all the people who see these icons, the Russian Orthodox people and the Orthodox people who see the icons are able to receive the message without the need for further translation. But the British soldiers we saw, they're definitely not getting the same message because they don't know the life and the history. So it's just a painting. But the people who know, this information is translated through the story.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, and, in my study, the theme of sacrifices maybe is seen in that mothers should be ready to sacrifice like soldiers do. So they kind of mother and soldiers is kind of a same in material. Maybe it means like just a patriotic citizens, but soldier is male and mother is female. But this theme is more visible in military patriotic education and on those discourses. Yes.
I think this is a great question and a key concept of sacrifice that ties all these three presentations together. And of course the big question then is sacrifice for what? Like what kind of an idea is strong enough to sort of create readiness to sacrifice? And this I cannot give a conclusive universal answer, but there are certainly some futures highlighted, like heroic action and certain ideals that make for, like for example, Uchiko was described as like a true Christian. So in some cases, for example, I think it could be justified that the fight against evil requires great sacrifices, and in these cases the sacrifice is then justified.
And in a way this whole theme is so central to traditionalist and also to the literature coming through Tolstoy and his sort of a portrayal of the moral superiority of the Russian soldier in sacrificing in face of this this Napoleonic army, etc. So it is interesting to see how this theme, in a way, is what kind of traces and what kind of new maybe forms it takes in TikTok or in some way, if there would be that sort of a push for such a theme put on the kind of forefront of the state propaganda or state education. So let's see. I mean, that requires that we have this multidisciplinary research environment where we look for the literature and academic literature and the popular culture, etc. So that will be super interesting in the future.
I certainly have some questions.
Oh yes, sorry. So we have 10 minutes, so please go ahead.
My first question is for Janna. So during your study and analysis of Russian military newspapers, these are official organs of the state, did you notice any patterns specifically in the use of gendered languages and collective nouns when referring to female service members?
Yeah, actually, there's a big paragraph in my study about that. But they use the word woman or девушка, a girl, and it's maybe 50 and 50 the use of them. But yeah, they use always the ending "a" to kind of emphasize to femaleness, even it is not necessary. And what else? Well, also there were like representatives of more beautiful gender and this kind of descriptions, a lot of, and very sexist descriptions, and also like Russian Amazons and beauties in uniforms and this kind of. But there were 1,000 of words for women in one material, and only once women were embedded in the ribiata, in the word ribiata, the guise, which can include both genders. So the femaleness is always like underlined.
I'm actually pretty surprised that you found 50-50 women and girls, because in the most of military media, and even the statements of ministers and presidents, девушки, girls. So I'm actually surprised about that. A follow-up, what about job titles and gendered job titles, those written by the journalists, and also perhaps if you know how self-description of female service members and their use of gendered job titles specifically, the desátnik versus desátničky.
I think it depends of the age of the woman or девушка, and maybe cadets use the word девушка more often, like when they are in the military academies, they are like девушкis or girls, and maybe when they enter the real army, they become and transform into the militarized women. Maybe, I'm not sure. But
have you noticed that they're always paratroopers, or are they always lady paratroopers?
I don't know.
And thank you, Janna. I've certainly been looking forward to your presentation all day. And a question for you. In regards to spiritual security, the Russian Armed Forces recognizes military chaplains of all recognized Russian faiths. There are Buddhist military chaplains, Islamic military chaplains, and of course, Orthodox, and even Jewish military chaplains. So how does spiritual security work for non-dominant faith members in the military?
I think this is definitely a good question, and I think this requires like a sociological approach at the lower level to answer. But it is quite an interesting sort of contradiction to highlight that they are all represented also, but then the certain narrative only pushes like one type of narrative out. And I would like to return your question. You mentioned that Uchiko is not so known outside of Russia, and I think this is definitely, like, I agree with this. And do you think this makes it a sort of more useful, or does it offer like a sort of empty form you can feel better when it's not so known outside of Russia?
Well, I think it's actually a problem because non-Russians, and I'm including the Ruski Mir, non-Russians are incorrectly or not coding Uchiko. They don't understand, so when you don't understand a language or a message, it's just noise. So, but that also presents a problem for Russia, who's trying to use him as a military and evangelical tool. If I'm trying to evangelize you all in French and you don't speak French, you're not going to get the message. So I feel that for the most point, Uchiko is being used within the Ruski Mir, and this includes the near abroad and different targets. But most of the targets are those related to Russia. But only recently have they started targeting non-Russians. Like, I was blown away that 8,000 British people have received the Order of Uchiko. Surprised that 8,000 of those men are still alive. And that is just, that's just the UK. So, and I've seen articles on TikTok and Russia Beyond the Headlines and RT, and also I've seen documentaries that have now been subtitled or dubbed in English, that they are seeing that there is this problem and the non-ability to code the message. So they're definitely working on it. But I think the majority of the target audience, at least for now, is those within the Ruski Mir.
Yeah. Okay, Jyrki, final question.
Just a short commentary. I had to say, because you mentioned also the Buddhists. I think it's, like in this context that we're talking about, it's rather interesting though that if we look at the Russian structure of security organs or of the army and security services, you have two very influential men like Sergei Shoigu, who is a Buddhist, and Gadio, of course, with having a quite central role, like in the machinery. Just a comment.
Yeah, that's an important note, and if I reserve a final note to myself, it would be to say that we kind of see in different ways the fragmentation of this cultural sphere. So even if Russia is prioritizing the so-called Ruski Mir, there not necessarily finds the understanding for the image of Uchiko in the way it wants to represent it. But at the same time, Russia is and going to face this sort of a criticism towards any representation of sacrifice or spiritual security within Russia as well. So as a final note, I think we are going to have a lot of interesting times ahead, but also interesting issues to study in the future. So let me now thank everybody, all the great audience, and especially our great speakers today for their work, and we are really looking forward to your written text as well and the future research. So thank you all.